Well, let's pick it up again here. We just finished with a review of the major literary movements. Now, if you're taking those notes, hopefully you're jotting those down, you'll see there's a lot of overlap. And that's part of what we find in The Luck of Roaring Camp. And in much of Bret Harte's work is a blend of romanticism and realism. Well, again, the Romantic period, as I gave you, and these are rough, and there's a lot of debate about where these periods line up exactly, but this is roughly the agreed upon years. The Romantic period I gave you is 1798 to 1870. Well, this text is written in 1868, so right at the tail end of the Romantic period. So we have massive Romantic influence, but if you note, so you have Transcendentalism, which the father of Transcendentalism is Transcendentalism. The father of that movement is a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson. I already quoted him, and that would have started in 1830. So that's before this text was written, obviously 1830. So we're looking at 1868. So Transcendentalism is kind of moving through Bret Harte's blood, you might say, through his system. The Victorian era, I mean, there's definitely influence in America. The Victorian era is really considered a British movement, but still, that was pervasive. You had some great works that were coming out of that would have influenced the writers in America as well. Realism, 1820. So again, long before we have Bret Harte's work, we have the realistic movement start in 1820. And then even naturalism really picks up in 1870 after Bret Harte's Luck of Roaring Camp. But still, think about that. So you have romantic work, you have romantic influences. We'll talk about what that means, what that romanticism, what kind of made up romanticism for the most part. But you also have realism that's swirling through the air, and transcendentalism. So we'll hit all those in a moment here, or at least for the most part, most of them. The Romantic movement, once again, 1798 to 1870. Romanticism, this movement, is not candlelit dinners and moonlit walks on the beach. Speaking of which, take a little look here. Gorgeous day today. This is a great area, this harbor, Dana Point Harbor. A lot of people walking by. Again, I think fitting well to both Romanticism and local color writing, because the Romantics would definitely appreciate the fact that we're out here in nature, not in a stuffy classroom, that we're talking about literature out in nature. It's definitely in line with the Romantic movement. So, but the Romantic movement is not considered, not just boils down, it would not just be considered candlelit dinners and moonlit walks on the beach. While these may take place in a romantic novel, the novel need not have romantic love affairs to fall into the Romantic classification. Romanticism is a literary, artistic, and philosophical movement that originated in the 18th century. Romanticism was in some ways a reaction against neoclassicism, which had reemerged during the Enlightenment. If you think about that term neoclassicism, it's a new classicism, a looking back toward the classics. Homer, Virgil, what were those guys doing? They were creating great heroes. They were looking at shaping what real beauty is. The Enlightenment authors thought, hey, we've lost this essence of what beauty really is. Beauty and nobility, what it means to be a real hero. The Enlightenment also emphasized reason, logic, removing a lot of the romantic elements of the imagination and feeling and intuition, emphasizing more on logic and the scientific method. The Romantics came along and said, no, man, we're missing too much of what was truly real in our human experience. We have to re-engage the imagination. And so that's what we see. An international artistic and philosophical movement is what Romanticism was, or is. And we still see the influence of Romanticism in our world today, in postmodern art. We still see influences of Romanticism even today. And as I go through this, perhaps you'll be thinking, where do we see these romantic elements even in movies, in art today? Literature, all kinds of different art. So Romanticism redefined the fundamental ways people in Western cultures thought about themselves and the world. The Romantic period connects with the age of revolutions. You think about the American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789. The Romantic movement connects with the upheavals in political, economic, and social traditions. Initial transformations of the Industrial Revolution. What was it about the Industrial Revolution that brought this new romantic fervor, this feeling of or this reaction against a lot of the things that are coming out of the Industrial Revolution. The Romantic period involved a revolutionary energy, many have said. It set out to transform theory and the practice of poetry and all art. It set out to transform the way we perceive the world. So I've got six major precepts of Romanticism. We're not going to go through all of these, but these will be important for you to know. Some major precepts of Romanticism. First one, the imagination. That's going to be the most important one. Second one, nature. Third, symbolism and myth. Those three are really the most important for our study of Bret Harte. Our fourth kind of major precept is emotion. Fifth, lyric poetry. And the sixth, the self. So, imagination. The imagination, according to the Romantics, is the supreme faculty of the mind. This was contrasted, as I just mentioned a second ago, with the supremacy of reason. All right? So by the Romantics, reason is supplanted. Reason was, for the Enlightenment, reason was the key top way of interpreting the world. Now with the Romantics, we flip that around. We say, no, the imagination is the supreme faculty of the mind. The imagination, according to the Romantics, is our ultimate shaping or creative power. The imagination is dynamic, not just passive. It is an active force with many functions. It is the foremost tool for creating all art. The imagination helps humans constitute reality. The Romantics would say there's a lot we can get from looking at the world through a logical point of view. There's a lot that science offers us, yes. But if you can only engage the world through science and logic, there's so much you miss. There's so much you can't understand. There's so much that just remains a mystery. We've got to engage the imagination because there's a lot that is unseen, that is you cannot put into a test tube in reality. So we must engage the imagination. Imagination helps humans constitute reality. William Wordsworth, one of the great fathers of Romanticism, suggested, he says this, "We not only perceive the world around us, but also in part create it. We unite both reason and feeling." Second major element in Romanticism, nature. Nature meant many things to the Romantics. As suggested before, it was often presented as itself a work of art. Nature was constructed by a divine imagination. The third element, symbolism and myth. Now, symbols were valued by the Romantics because they could simultaneously suggest many things. That's what a symbol can do, right? A symbol can simultaneously suggest many things. If I said my keys are a symbol for freedom, how can a key be a symbol for freedom? Well, there's a lot of ways you can look at that, right? It could open a door. The key could open up a new passageway, a new way of thinking. A symbol was valued above the idea of an allegory, where with an allegory you have a one-to-one relationship between two things, a one-to-one relationship. Often you think of, say, in Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, allegory, you have a character named Christian. So who is Christian? Well, he is a Christian. He is a man who becomes a Christian. You have a character called Doubt. Well, who is that? Well, there's no confusion. Oh, does doubt mean intellectual exploration? No. Doubt just means simply doubt. And so in allegory, you have a one-to-one value, one-to-one relationship. But in symbolism, you have multiple meanings for a symbol. Also with symbolism, we have myth. Myth, in the ways that a Romantic would interpret it, myth is a symbolic narrative. So it's a story, basically, a symbolic story. Again, not to be confused with allegory. In myth, the relationship between the symbol and the thing which it represents is not as closely connected as it would be in an allegory. There is room for interpretation. Next, and the last one I want to review with you here in terms of the elements of Romanticism would be the individual, the self. The Romantic hero For the Romantics, the importance of the individual, the unique, even the eccentric, cannot be understated. The romantic hero is more often on a journey of self-discovery, less often on a journey for his country or his clan. That's an important difference. When we look at a story like the Iliad or the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, take Virgil, right? Virgil's Aeneid, you have a hero, Aeneas, and his job, his God-given duty is to go and establish a new nation. And he, at one point in the Aeneid, he finds a great love in Dido, in a place called Carthage. Falls deeply in love with her. And the gods come to him and they say, hey, this is not about you, man. This is about your country. This is about establishing the new Troy. And you've got to go. You've got to give up this thing that you love for yourself. And you've got to do this for your nation, for your son. You fool. And the gods come in and rebuke Aeneas at one point during that great story. Now that is a classic view of a hero. The hero does what? The hero fights for his nation, for his clan, for his people, for the generations that would come after him. The romantic hero is about self-development. One of the romantic elements we see in a story like Huck Finn, for instance, is Huck Finn, does he develop as a young man? Well, in some ways he rejects the views of slavery and racism that his culture really is steeped in. And he takes on a different view of race and slavery. He rejects it. And we see him as a great romantic hero in that way. Or he can be interpreted as a great romantic hero because what he develops as an individual, apart from his society. He rejects some of the things of his society to create a new view of reality. So the romantic hero, as an individual, is on a journey of self-discovery, oftentimes. So local color and romanticism. In local color writing, elements of both romanticism and realism are often woven together. How can this be? The local color writers tried to imitate and recreate the sounds and smells of the places they were writing about. They tried to paint a vivid picture, drawing in close, tightening the frame, as we might say, in photography. Zooming in. Realism usually involves zooming in. The exact opposite can be said of romanticism. More often than not, the romantics zoom out. They seek a wider frame to take in a larger picture of humanity, a larger picture of life. How does Bret Harte employ both of these techniques? How does he both zoom in and zoom out? Alright, so let's take a look at this text here. I'm working with my Kindle version of The Luck of Roaring Camp. And we start with this. There was a commotion in Roaring Camp. It could not have been a fight, for in 1850 that was not novel enough to have called together the entire settlement. Again, there's local color right there, right? A fight? People are always fighting. There's always barroom brawls. This is the West. This is the frontier. The ditches and claims were not only deserted, but Tuttle's Grocery had contributed its gamblers, who, it will be remembered, calmly continued their game the day that French Pete and Kanaka Joe shot each other to death over the bar in the front room. The whole camp was collected before a rude cabin on the outer edge of the clearing. Conversation was carried on in a low tone, but the name of a woman was frequently repeated. It was a name familiar enough in the camp. Remember earlier I said, often the only woman in a city or the only woman in a town would be the town prostitute. Well, there's a town prostitute, and there's only one of them. She's going to be pretty familiar to a lot of the guys. It was a name familiar enough in the camp, Cherokee Sal. Perhaps the less said of her, the better. She was a coarse and, it is to be feared, a very sinful woman. But at that time, she was the only woman in Roaring Camp, and was just then lying in sore extremity when she most needed the ministration of her own sex. She needed the help of another woman, right? Dissolute, abandoned, and irreclaimable, she was yet suffering a martyrdom hard enough to bear, even when veiled by sympathizing womanhood, but now terrible in her loneliness. Some interesting words being connected here. So we have a prostitute, a town whore, named Cherokee Sal. She's giving birth, and her birth, the birth of this child that she's going to have. She is called in that process a martyr, which is an interesting kind of connection of two images, right? And a martyr is usually associated with the life of a saint. This is kind of a paradoxical relation of this, or an unconventional use of this term for this woman who's a prostitute, not considered a saint, and yet she is called a martyr. The primal curse had come to her in that original isolation, which must have made the punishment of the first transgression so dreadful. I mentioned before that one of the techniques that Bret Harte employs in his texts is the use of the biblical stories, of biblical ideas, biblical tropes. And so here he is saying the primal curse. If you look back at the book of Genesis, you'll see one of the curses that God places on humanity is the curse for the woman to have great pain in childbearing. And so Bret Harte's pulling that in here. Again, connecting Eve with this Cherokee sow. Interesting kind of paradoxical connection. You wouldn't naturally make this connection between a town prostitute and Eve from the Garden of Eden. So here from the very beginning we have an interesting kind of point of view. Does the narrator look at or with the characters? I think this is a good question to ask as we read this text. How is this being narrated? Who's telling the story? Are we looking at the characters from a distance, from a vantage point above, or are we looking at the characters from their own point of view? Are we looking with them? What characters in the text are excluded from sharing the point of view? Whose point of view do we not have in this text? And what effect does this have on the story? Let's go on. It was perhaps part of the expiation of her sin that at a moment when she most lacked her sex's intuitive tenderness and care, she met only the half-contemptuous faces of her masculine associates. Yet a few of the spectators were, I think, touched by her sufferings. Sandy Tipton thought it was rough on Sal, and in the contemplation of her condition, for a moment rose superior to the fact that he had an ace and 2 bowers in his sleeve. All right, so she doesn't have any women to take care of her as she's giving birth. But what she does have are some men that really rise above or out of their normal station in life. She has gamblers. She has men who are part of the frontier life, who are rough and coarse and kind of brutal in many ways. Who are cheaters in some ways too. And here's a guy with cards up his sleeve. That's not really legal. And so she has cheaters and gamblers that have come to her aid who are rising above their normal station in life to help out a woman who is giving birth to a child. This is the irony that Bret Harte introduces to his text. Right? You have the local color writing, you have these men who are gamblers and cowboys, and now you have a woman who's in labor. What's going to happen? Are they going to rise above their normal station? Are they going to rise above who they are in many ways as men to a higher level? And this would be in many ways a romantic view of life, that we can rise above our expected or our normal station in life to do something bigger beyond what we'd even imagine. Well, it goes on. It will be seen also that the situation was novel. Deaths were by no means uncommon in Roaring Camp, but a birth was a new thing. People had been dismissed the camp effectively. Finally, and with no possibility of return, but this was the first time that anybody had been introduced ab initio, at birth, right? Hence the excitement. "You go in there, Stumpy," said a prominent citizen known as Ken Tuck, addressing one of the loungers. "Go in there and see what you can do. You've had experience in them things." Again, here we see some dialectical writing. Dialectical writing is a term we use. Mark Twain is one of the most famous dialectical writers of all time because he had the ability, the skill to recreate a dialect in writing. This is a very difficult technique, one that if you try to do yourself, you'll discover is not easy. And so Bret Harte here interpreting, using the local dialect. You can hear it. "Go in there and see what you can do. You've had experience in them things." He's got an accent. His name is Kentuck. We assume he's a transplant from Kentucky. None of these men would have been born in California. It's such a new settlement that it was. And he goes on. "Perhaps there was a fitness in the selection. Stumpy, in other climes, had been a putative head of 2 families. In fact, it was owing to some legal informality in these proceedings that Roaring-Camp, a city of refuge, was indebted to his company. The crowd approved the choice, and Stumpy was wise enough to bow to the majority. The door closed on the extempore surgeon and midwife. That's what Stumpy becomes, because he has families. Supposedly he has 2 families. This is a bit of a controversial subject with him, right? He's been in trouble with the law because he has 2 families. Not legal to have 2 wives, obviously polygamy. So 2 families, but he's the most experienced family man. So Stumpy, get in there, right? The door closed on the extemporaneous, right, on the spontaneously dubbed surgeon, Stumpy, and he was also the midwife. And Roaring-Camp sat down outside, smoked its pipe, and awaited the issue. This is another interesting literary strategy here, that Roaring-Camp is seen as one united body, right? One united body, which is it's a fascinating kind of connection. Another romantic view of humanity, really coming together as a united whole. That Roaring-Camp could all sit outside. That Roaring-Camp as one body could smoke its pipe and await the issue. Now the issue, that's another kind of interesting term there, issue being the issue of a child, right? For a woman to have an issue is to have a child. But there's another use of the term here, double use of the term issue, that this is a whole new issue for them. They don't know what to do with this baby. What are they going to do with a baby? These guys are rough and tumble men. I've mentioned this. They're cowboys and gamblers, frontiersmen. They're gold diggers and miners. What are they going to do with a baby out there? The assemblage numbered about 100 men. 1 or 2 of these were active fugitives from justice. Some were criminal, and all were reckless. Physically, they exhibited no indication of their past lives and character. The greatest scamp had a Raphael face, with a profusion of blonde hair. Raphael face, a very innocent face. Oakhurst, a gambler, had the melancholy air and intellectual abstraction of a Hamlet. Again, pulling in some literary types, right? Hamlet, the coolest and most courageous man, was scarcely over 5 feet in height, with a soft voice and an embarrassed, timid manner. The term roughs, applied to them, was a distinction rather than a definition. And that's an interesting way of looking at this, because that's what Bret Harte's trying to do, right? He's taking these lowlifes, we talked about this before, he's taking lowlifes and making them his heroes. Well, a simple lowlife wouldn't normally be a hero. But here we have Bret Harte that is redefining what a hero is. He's taking lowlifes and showing them the complexity of these men's lives. Roughs applied to them as a distinction rather than a definition. The term rough would not define them as men, but only the distinctions of their characters. We'll take a little break.